I didn't know my marriage was ending when my wife first used the word monogamy like it was a diagnosis. She didn't say it with anger. She didn't say it during a fight. She said it thoughtfully, almost academically, like someone presenting a concept they'd already accepted as truth. We were sitting in our kitchen late one evening, the house quiet in that way only a long marriage understands. The kids were grown and gone. The television was off. 2 glasses of wine sat untouched between us. "Daniel," Sophia said, resting her chin on her hand, "don't you ever wonder if monogamy limits personal growth?" I remember the exact moment because my first instinct was to laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it felt unreal. "Limits it how?" I asked. She exhaled slowly, as if she'd been waiting for the question. "It creates dependence. It traps people in roles they outgrow." That was the first time I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. We'd been married 23 years. I was 50 years old. A risk assessment consultant by trade. My job was to identify unseen dangers before they caused damage. And yet somehow, I had missed the most important one. Sophia and I met in our late 20s. She was ambitious, articulate, intense in a way that made people lean forward when she spoke. I was quieter. Methodical. I believed in structure, in follow-through, in promises that meant something because you kept them even when they became inconvenient. We balanced each other, at least that's what I believed. I worked long hours building a stable career. She built hers later, transitioning into leadership coaching once the kids were older. I supported her through certifications, conferences, and career pivots without complaint. We weren't perfect. No marriage is. But we were loyal. Or so I thought. We shared routines. Morning coffee. Evening walks. The unspoken language of a life lived together. Until that language began to change. Over the past year, Sophia had started attending high-end retreats and workshops, executive gatherings filled with people who spoke in polished metaphors and believed every problem could be solved by reframing it. She came home energized. Different. She talked about liberation. About breaking patterns. About authentic connection. At first, I assumed it was professional enthusiasm. But then the conversations became personal. "Jealousy is just fear," she said one night. "Commitment shouldn't feel like obligation," another time. I listened carefully. I didn't argue. Risk assessment isn't about reacting. It's about noticing patterns. And the pattern forming was unmistakable. Soon, the ideas weren't just hers. They belonged to a group. New friends. Couples we'd never socialized with before. Dinners where the wine flowed freely and everyone spoke confidently about how traditional marriage was outdated. One man laughed openly about fidelity being a social myth. One woman referred to her husband as a primary partner instead of a spouse. Sophia watched them like a student absorbing doctrine. "You should try being more open," she told me after one of those dinners. "Open to what?" I asked. "To growth." That word again. Growth. Always growth. Never accountability. The first rail crack appeared on a Sunday morning. She sat across from me at the table, hands folded, posture deliberate. "I don't want to cheat on you," she said. My stomach tightened. "But," she continued, "I also don't want to lie to myself." I waited. "I've developed feelings for someone," she admitted. "Nothing physical yet. But it could be." There it was. The truth, softened by intention. "Who?" I asked. She hesitated. "Someone from the retreat circle." I nodded slowly. "And what exactly are you asking me to do with this information?" She met my eyes. "I want honesty between us. I want to explore this without secrecy." "In other words," I said calmly, "you want permission." She flinched. "I want evolution." When I didn't immediately agree, the pressure started. Not just from her, but from others. Friends who suddenly wanted to check in. Couples dinners turned into quiet interrogations. "Have you considered an open structure? Monogamy works until it doesn't. Real love isn't possessive." They spoke gently. Sympathetically. As if I were the one struggling with reality. Sophia watched me during these conversations, measuring my responses. Waiting for me to adapt. She made it official one evening. I want to open the marriage, she said. With boundaries. Transparency. And if I say no? Her voice hardened slightly. Then you're choosing fear over trust. No, I replied. I'm choosing monogamy. She stared at me like I'd confessed to something shameful. That's insecurity talking, she said. That's my standard, I answered. The silence that followed wasn't explosive. It was final. 2 weeks later, she stopped pretending it was theoretical. She came home late. Too late. Stopped answering calls. Changed passwords. When I asked her directly, she didn't deny it. Yes, she said quietly. I crossed a line. No details. No drama. Just confirmation. I didn't mean to hurt you, she added. I just couldn't keep denying myself. I nodded. And in that moment, I knew something she didn't. This marriage was already over. The strangest thing about betrayal isn't the act itself. It's how quickly the world reorganizes around it. When Sophia crossed the line, I expected anger. Guilt. Maybe even fear. What I didn't expect was confidence, hers, and eventually, everyone else's. She didn't hide the affair. She explained it. She never used the word cheating. That word was crude. Unsophisticated. Too judgmental. Instead, she called it self-discovery. This isn't about replacing you, she told me one night, standing in the doorway of our bedroom while I sat on the edge of the bed. It's about finally being honest with myself. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need to. The late nights. The unfamiliar cologne. The sudden emotional distance. Confirmation had already done enough damage. What about honesty with me? I asked. She looked genuinely confused. I'm being honest, she said. I'm telling you how I feel. That's when I realized we weren't even speaking the same language anymore. Word got out fast. Not the affair itself, but the story surrounding it. Friends started calling. Texting. Checking in. At first, I thought they were concerned. I was wrong. They came bearing understanding, for her. She's just trying to grow. She felt stifled. You can't expect one person to be everything forever. No one asked how I was sleeping. No one asked what it felt like to watch my marriage dissolve in real time. They assumed the answer. I must have been distant. Rigid. Emotionally unavailable. It was easier to believe that than to confront what she'd done. One evening, Sophia asked if I'd join her for dinner with some of her new friends. For closure, she said. I agreed, not because I wanted to reconcile, but because I needed to understand what I was up against. The dinner was elegant. Expensive. Carefully curated. Everyone spoke softly. Thoughtfully. As if emotion itself were a liability. One man leaned back in his chair and said, "Monogamy works until consciousness expands." Another woman nodded. People confuse commitment with ownership. Sophia watched me the entire time. Waiting to see if I'd break. So, Daniel, someone finally asked, how are you handling the transition? Transition. I took a sip of water before answering. I'm not transitioning, I said calmly. I'm exiting. The table went quiet. Sophia's smile faltered. After that dinner, the tone changed. People stopped asking questions and started offering assessments. You're threatened by her growth. You never evolved emotionally. You prioritized structure over intimacy. They spoke as if my loyalty were a pathology. As if monogamy were a character flaw. Sophia didn't correct them. She didn't have to. Their words justified her choices and reframed mine as the real problem. The moment that changed everything came quietly. I was alone in the house, sitting in the living room we'd shared for over 2 decades, when I realized something fundamental. I wasn't angry anymore. I was clear. Clarity is dangerous because it leaves no room for denial. I wasn't fighting for my marriage. I wasn't fighting for her approval. I was fighting not to betray myself. And that fight was over. I met with a lawyer the next morning. No threats. No ultimatums. No accusations. Just facts. I want a clean divorce, I said. No drama. Sophia was surprised when I told her. You're giving up without trying, she said. I tried, I replied. I just refused to change my values to match your justification. She accused me of abandoning her when she needed support. I didn't argue. Some conversations don't need rebuttals. They need endings. I moved into a small apartment overlooking the river. No echoes. No memories clinging to the walls. Just quiet. I unpacked slowly. Deliberately. I kept my routines. Morning walks. Evening reading. Work that demanded precision and rewarded calm thinking. The silence didn't feel empty. It felt honest. As weeks passed, the tone of Sophia's calls changed. The excitement faded. Her new relationship, the one built on freedom and ideology, started cracking under reality. Jealousy crept in. Expectations surfaced. Boundaries blurred. Turns out when everything is negotiable, nothing feels secure. She mentioned arguments. Insecurity. Doubt. I listened without comment. I wasn't her anchor anymore. Freedom, I learned, is intoxicating at first. It feels like power. Like possibility. But when it's built on betrayal, it doesn't age well. Sophia's calls became more frequent. Not desperate. Not yet. Just uncertain. She would mention small things at first. He doesn't like when I work late. He says he's fine with independence, but then gets upset when I take space. It's strange, he talks about openness. But he's incredibly possessive. I didn't comment. I listened the way you listen to weather reports about storms that are no longer headed your way. She wasn't calling because she needed advice. She was calling because she needed contrast. The same friends who once surrounded her began to drift. Not dramatically. Quietly. Dinner invitations slowed. Messages went unanswered. Conversations became surface level. Ideology is exciting when it's theoretical. It's exhausting when it becomes inconvenient. Her circle didn't abandon her, but they stopped validating her. And that hurt more than criticism ever could. One evening, she came to the apartment unannounced. I hadn't given her the address. She'd gotten it from a mutual friend. She looked different. Not unkempt. Just tired. I didn't think this would be so hard, she said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. I didn't invite her in. What did you think it would be? I asked. She hesitated. I thought honesty would feel lighter. And does it? She shook her head slowly. It feels unstable. That was the first time she used the word. She told me then, without embellishment. The affair had become physical weeks before she asked to open the marriage. The ideology came after, not before. It wasn't discovery. It was justification. I didn't want to be the villain, she said quietly. I nodded. Most people don't. She cried then. Real tears. Not defensive. Not performative. I miss us, she said. I miss how safe things were. Safe. The word she once treated like an insult. I want to come back, she said. Not try again. Not rebuild. Come back. As if I were a place she could return to once the experiment failed. I didn't raise my voice. You didn't leave a house, I said calmly. You left a boundary. She looked confused. I can't undo what I did, she said. But we can move forward. I shook my head. Moving forward only works when both people are facing the same direction. While her world contracted, mine expanded. Not socially. Internally. I stopped explaining myself. Stopped defending my choices. I joined a small hiking group. Took a solo trip I'd postponed for years. Reconnected with work in a way that felt intentional, not escapist. I wasn't lonely. I was aligned. There's a difference most people don't understand until they experience it. We met one final time for coffee. She looked nervous. Hopeful. I was wrong about monogamy, she said. I confused excitement with fulfillment. I met her eyes. I know. So you still believe in it, she asked. I didn't answer right away. I thought about the years we built. The years she dismantled. The peace I'd found afterward. Yes, I said. I do. Her voice softened. With me. That's when I said it. Calmly. Clearly. Monogamy wasn't my weakness, I told her. It was my standard. She nodded. No anger. No argument. Just understanding, too late to matter. She left without asking again. And that was that. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It never does. It happened quietly, through unanswered messages, awkward silences, and the slow realization that freedom without responsibility isn't freedom at all. Sophia's relationship didn't explode. It eroded. The man she'd chosen, so fluent in the language of openness, was far less comfortable living it. He wanted transparency, but only on his terms. Independence, but only when it didn't inconvenience him. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same traits she'd once praised as emotional maturity, detachment, flexibility, non-attachment, became sources of anxiety when they were turned back on her. There was no anchor. No assumption of loyalty. No shared future to stabilize conflict. Every disagreement felt existential. Because when nothing is promised, everything feels temporary. Friends who once praised her courage stopped calling. Not out of judgment, out of exhaustion. There's only so long people will engage with someone who keeps needing reassurance that their choices were brave, enlightened, necessary. Eventually, even the most sympathetic audience grows tired of validation without accountability. She noticed. She told me once, during our last phone call, I didn't think I'd feel this alone. I didn't say anything. Loneliness isn't cured by commentary. While her world shrank, mine clarified. I didn't replace her. I didn't rush into anything new. I learned to sit with myself without distraction. I rebuilt my days deliberately, work I respected, relationships that felt mutual, routines that didn't require justification. I stopped explaining why monogamy mattered to me. People who needed an explanation were never going to understand it anyway. Months later, I heard through mutual acquaintances that the relationship was over. No drama. No public reckoning. Just a quiet ending. The same way our marriage had ended, only without the illusion of novelty to soften the fall. She didn't reach out again. Some bridges don't burn. They simply stop being crossed. People talk about monogamy like it's fragile. Like it's restrictive. Like it can't survive modern life. What they rarely admit is that monogamy demands something many people are no longer willing to give. Consistency. Accountability. The courage to face boredom without betrayal. Monogamy doesn't fail because it's outdated. It fails when people abandon it instead of tending to it. I don't resent Sophia. Resentment requires